everybody for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. So they are hopefully both reasonably well known to you. Professor Paul Resnick is also our Associate Dean. He does a lot of work in what he calls social technical capital, which is about using technology in ways to enable people to make more productive use of their social relationships. And he's particularly a pioneer in the use of recommender systems. He's also the author of a book called Building Successful Online Communities. Mark Newman is associate professor here in HCI, and he's the head of the Interaction Ecologies group. And they look at different ways in which people can make better use of the technologies that are in their environments, which are increasingly interconnected. And one thing I will mention about both of them is that they are both musicians. Paul is a pretty mean fiddle player, and he plays a few other stringed instruments. And then Mark, I was discovering as hunting around on his website, has a secret life as a musician as well. And as far as I could tell, his range extends from thrash metal to ambient electronic music. Is that a reasonable description of what you do?
Kind of a historical description. Dormant.
But anyway, yeah, without further ado, let's welcome Paul and Mark.
Thanks. So we're going to do this as a tag team. We want to talk about application-oriented HCI research. This is going to be a meta talk. We are not going to present the results of any particular research project. We're reflecting a little bit on what is involved in application-oriented HCI research, and in particular, what it tries to produce at the end. So why are we giving this talk? We, not just us, but a lot of the we here, do application-oriented research in HCI. Some of you may not realize that you do that. A little bit like Pierre's character, who at the end of the conversation realizes that for the past 40 years he's been speaking in prose. And we've been doing HCI research, maybe not everybody for 40 years, but we've been doing it, but people get started doing it with us, our students, and the goals are often unclear. Are we trying to invent new apps that are better than all the ones that Silicon Valley is trying to invent? Are we trying to characterize something about them? Are we trying to critique them, say what's wrong with them? Are we trying to define requirements? What is it that we're trying to produce? And because that hasn't even been well articulated by the larger research community, how to teach it is an even harder problem that we're each struggling to invent by ourselves. And we've been chatting about this, Mark Newman, Mark Ackerman, and I, someone Tawana, and various other people at different times, and we thought maybe it's time to put out some kind of manifesto of the Michigan School that might try to characterize what is application-oriented design research. So in this talk, I'm going to try to, I know in our abstract we promised to do an ontology and an epistemology. What is knowledge that gets produced, and how do we know that it's true? But I'm actually really just going to focus on the first one. What kind of knowledge are we trying to produce? I'm not going to offer you a recipe for how, if you follow these steps, you will have a successful application-oriented design research project. But we're trying to build towards some kind of manifesto. This is very early on. Some of you saw us in 4370 last week having our first actual discussion about where we are. And one of the nice things when you know you're sort of on the right track towards producing a manifesto is that people have been separately thinking about things for a long time, and when you sit down to try to put it together, you keep saying, yeah, what you said, yeah, that's right. And so I think we're on that path, and we're pretty early on that path. So today we're going to put something out there. We're going to try not to apologize too much as we go, try to state things as strongly as we can without too many caveats. But we'd like your input. We welcome your challenges. We'd love examples from you. And hopefully over the next few months, maybe with input from a bunch of people, we'll put together some kind of document. So what do we mean by applications? Basically, use of technology to solve human problems. So humans acting through technology to interact with each other, to interact with their environment in some goal-oriented way to produce some desired outcome. So like improving health, limit our use of resources so that we'll have enough for future generations, or supporting economic development, or, because those are all, big human problems. We also have, lots of times application-oriented design research is dealing with little problems, like, who's cooking dinner tonight? Or, how am I getting home? Or, how do I keep track of all my to-dos? So, big problems, little problems, but design of technologies that are supposed to support people achieving their goals. So, that's applications, application-oriented research. Well, research in general is going to be about trying to generate and communicate new knowledge, things that we didn't know and nobody else knew before. In application-oriented research, that kind of knowledge we're going to argue is design knowledge. Knowledge about how to create a system, how to make choices in building a system that are applications, systems that are trying to solve some particular human problems. So our proposal is that what design knowledge looks like is claims. Claims of the form, system attributes lead to benefits under some specified conditions. But this is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to get to in application-oriented design research. And we'll talk about some stepping stones and intermediate things along the way that can be valuable contributions to research, but this is what is the ultimate goal. Now, these are not the only kind of contribution that counts. There are other things, but we are arguing that the other things are largely stepping stones to this ultimate goal. So we cleverly chose an A word, a B word, and a C word. So attributes, benefits, and conditions. And this is our pictorial representation. This is what the basic form of a claim is. A's lead to B, but only under certain contexts or conditions C. So A is an attribute, B is a benefit. We'll talk about the impact. What impact does A have on B, and under what condition or context? Now, occasionally, the benefit isn't really a benefit. So there is valuable design knowledge to say, if you do A, this bad thing will happen. So sometimes it's a D, at least in sequence. So A leads to D under condition C. So some examples. And these are things that if you're a doctoral student here, you probably run into these in some form, but I'll remind you of the UbiFit garden paper from Sonny Gonsalvo et al. The claim is that as a result of this design work and an experiment that they did, they are claiming that the presence of an ambient feedback interface leads to increased exercise. People see those little butterflies and garden things on their cell phone, it makes them walk. So here A is ambient feedback on the mobile phone, B is increased walking, and they articulate that it's only for people who are motivated to walk and who are reasonably healthy. They only recruited those kind of people. They don't also mention that it's not quite as well articulated, but there are other conditions. There's people who are willing to wear a pedometer, people who use a mobile phone regularly, or carry that around and look at the screen so they can notice that ambient feedback. So you might think about adding other conditions. In the book that Kentaro mentioned on building successful online communities, we organize all of the chapters around these design claims. One of them is rewards that are task contingent lead to gaming the system. So if you give students points for turning in assignments, but don't actually look at the content of what they turn in. So that's a reward that is task contingent, just doing the assignment, but not contingent on performance, doing it well. Then you'll get some students in the class who will turn in blank assignments, who will game the system. So, but this is, you know, a much more general claim that anytime you have task contingent and not performance contingent rewards, it'll lead to some gaming of the system. And in that claim, we don't say anything about C. We don't say anything about what context. So whether correct or not, the claim is stated as if this is everyone everywhere. And you know, there's room for someone to come along and give a more refined claim that says, well, you know, what about in this culture where there's a strong social norm and no one would ever do that? What if there's an honor code? But this is the claim as stated there. Another one for those of you who saw faculty candidate Nikki Dell last year. She's got a claim, processing diagnostic tests locally on a mobile phone, and this was a project she did in India, right?
Kenya.
In Kenya, where they implemented something and did field trials with it. So processing diagnostic tests locally on a mobile phone is required to integrate into an effective workflow of rural clinics in developing regions. This is not a quote from her paper. This is us sort of turning the whole paper into the results of the paper into a claim. And local processing, the idea is that they're using the phone and a camera, and one design you could imagine is they send the pictures off to a central server and you've got lots of computer processing, and it runs the test and sends it back to the phone and says, yes, the person has the disease, or no, they don't. But they didn't do that. They worked really hard to be able to do the processing on the mobile phone, and so that's the local processing part. And part of their claim is this was necessary, that in some of the rural places where they did this, that's the C, rural clinics with spotty connectivity, that is places where some days the phone wouldn't connect to the server, and some days it would, that if they didn't have that, if they didn't have the local processing, they could have still done the diagnostics, but then it wouldn't have worked with the way people were actually conducting medicine in that setting. All right, so A leads to B under condition C. Here's a little bit of a nod to epistemology, like how would we know whether A actually leads to B under condition C? And we might have some forms of evidence. And that evidence might affect how confident we are in the link. It also might, we've just drawn this arrow, A leads to B. Sometimes we mean A if and only if. Sometimes we mean if A then B. Sometimes we mean A only if B. So all of those things, but the evidence will change the nature of the claim that you make and how confident you are in that linkage. Okay, so application-oriented design research is saying at the end should somehow end up with these design claims, but not all design claims are equally good. So to be a good design claim, it ought to be true. You can make lots of claims that just aren't true. They're not it's not a good outcome from your research. So it should be well supported by evidence. And then we've got some other things that are more around what makes it better than another. So it should be general. And I'll say a little bit more that the more general, the better for the A's and the C's. So larger attributes, more general attributes, more wide conditions. It's better if we have a more precise version of that linkage element. So a less precise version is affects B. Slightly more is increases B. A more precise one is each 2-unit increase in A leads to a 7-unit increase in B, like you get from a regression model. So more precise is better for these claims. Well articulated is better, so the more easily measurable and clearer the B's are, the better. And the B's and C's should matter. And Mark will talk a little bit more about B's, how we know that B's matter and where domain expertise comes in there. And of course, the context should matter too. They should be contexts where we care about, like if we're especially interested in reducing inequality, then the C ought to include the marginalized groups. So those are what makes good design claims. If they're, we often say research claims, not just around design claims, ought to be significant, novel, and valid, and those largely line up with what we're saying about design claims. But a design claim could be good even if it wasn't novel. It was well known, but to be a valuable research claim, it ought to also be novel. And may be surprising. So no one has claimed this before, but everybody knew it. No one had said it. It might be a little bit of a contribution just to articulate it, but it's more of a contribution if it's surprising, not known, and not obvious. I alluded to this already, but bigger is better for context. Yes, Tom?
What do you think of the canonical research on its structure? Like an ACM literature.
I think we can solve that.
Yeah, I think the three that we were showing before, we tried to pick things that we thought would, yeah, we weren't picking out things that were bad design things. So. Arguably, some things are more or less obvious. One of the problems is that when you really nail something and you state it very clearly as a design claim and you have really strong evidence for it, people then think that they knew it all along. So things become retrospectively obvious that weren't obvious originally. Sometimes you have to anticipate that as a researcher and document how skeptical the world was before you demonstrated some evidence for the claim that you're making. So bigger is better for the context. You can say that A leads to B in context 1, in context 2, and context 3. That's better than just saying it leads to B in context 1. So the broader the context, the better. You can't always get that, but if you can, it's good. We also think bigger is better for A, for the A's. So you can make a claim that says, you know, this is a good mouse for achieving the task of pointing to something. Or you could say, any optical mouse with these characteristics is useful for pointing somewhere. And being more general is better. This is often a big challenge for us in articulating what do we know from application-oriented design research. You have a particular thing that you might have seen work, or maybe you created it and you demonstrated it that it works, but you want to be able to make some claim about some attribute of it that's the secret sauce, that's the key ingredient. And so characterizing something about the design space, the space of attributes, and being able to say all the things that have this kind of attribute will have that same positive effect. That's a better kind of design. Sometimes we can't do it. You know, the same thing is not true of all A's or all C's. And then we have things like, say, you end up having to say, this attribute is helpful in context C1, and this other attribute is more helpful in context C2. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark for more good stuff.
Okay, and so I'm going to sort of try to elaborate on this a little bit and discuss first, what does it mean to put claims at the center, and then where does this leave us in terms of other questions that we need to answer or work through to build this framework. So putting claims at the center, by saying claims are kind of the most important or central form of knowledge in application-oriented research, does a few things for us. First of all, it clarifies some things that are not contributions, right? So a common mistake I've noticed, including myself when I was a doctoral student, if you're technically oriented, you build something really cool and you want to claim that that's a contribution, you want to write a paper about it, and this kind of clarifies that that's not really the contribution. The contribution is the knowledge, that is the portable, reusable knowledge. So even if 7 people liked it, just building a cool thing doesn't constitute a contribution necessarily. It also helps us ask, and I'll go through this in a little bit, how does what I find contribute to better designs? If we say at the end of it, this is what design knowledge looks like, we can talk about other forms of contribution that we often see in HCI and application-oriented HCI, and ask how do they kind of fit in with design knowledge and the ultimate goals. We'll talk about this in a little bit. We are pro, in this analysis here, we're pro design implications for those of you who are aware of the arguments around whether design implications should be part of CAD papers. We're basically saying yes. At the end of the day, application-oriented research at least should have implications for design. And not all findings are design claims. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Putting claims at the center also helps us compare and synthesize research in the same area. So we can look at a design space like technologies that encourage physical activity, and we can say, well, what do we know about it, and how strongly do we know these things? We can start to build maps of different design domains, and that'll help us look for places where we don't have enough knowledge, or places where maybe we have some confidence in how to design these systems. And so it helps us clarify the limitations of our knowledge. Okay, so we've posited that claims of this form, A leads to B or A influences B under condition C, is a central or very important, or perhaps even the ultimate goal, ultimate form of knowledge for application-oriented research. But there's a lot of other forms of research contributions that are important and play a role. And so we might talk about papers or projects that help us learn more about the problems and breakdowns that people encounter, sensitizing concepts, things we ought to be aware of when we're designing a particular area, requirements, guidelines, principles, and design heuristics and concepts. So let's talk about a little bit about how these might contribute. So if we have a study that looks at the problems and breakdowns that occur when people are engaging in a particular domain, this might tell us something about the benefits that we ought to be looking for in our system design. So how do we know if our system is working well? Well, it might help people overcome those problems, overcome those breakdowns. So it gives us a map of what is it that we are looking for there. So sensitizing concepts, these are often things that say we should be aware that we might need to think about this particular situation or context. It might say we might need to be aware that there's different types of people that use this system. This system might need to be used by kids and by elderly people and by tech-savvy youngsters, and those might all have different interests. So just knowing what the C's are that are important could be helpful for mapping out design space, for doing research in a particular application area. I'm going to skip requirements for a moment and come back to it. Guidelines and principles are often sort of general statements that particular system attributes are generally good for a wide class of different things, right? And so we might have information that social navigation is a good feature to support in a wide variety of different social computing type systems. And then we need to take that and map it into particular application domains to see if it actually works under the C's that we care about. But we might generate general design guidelines and principles through research that we do without being specific necessarily about the C's. And then we might have design heuristics and concepts, which are basically things of the form that, in general, a system attribute A leads to certain types of benefits across a wide variety of situations. And again, we might look for opportunities to apply that in particular cases. Requirements. So looking at how these get used and talked about in HCI papers and things like that. Requirements, the way they're used colloquially at least, can really point to any of these things. You can have a requirement that says you need to be aware of the following types of users, or the following types of user needs, or your systems should always have A in them, or we need to make sure we maximize B and things like that. So requirements are kind of a general term. There's one more form of design knowledge which we forgot about until we had finished the rest of that slide build, and so we didn't go back and put it on the rest of them. But there's another form which is the existence proof, which basically says we have a demonstration that A leads to B under a particular condition C, and if that's surprising, if you wouldn't have expected that to happen, that can be an existence proof, but maybe we need to do more to find out how robust that is under condition C, how we can change the conditions and still observe those benefits and so forth. I would argue that the term design implications, which I've mentioned a couple times already, can be used to describe any of these forms of knowledge, but usually it's sort of a signaling that you're a little bit less confident in what you're saying. It's like, so we did this research and we want to imply the following for design, but maybe we're not totally sure yet and more research needs to be done before it can turn into a claim or a heuristic or a sensitizing concept or something like that. Okay, so in the next phase, I'm going to talk about some of the discussion, some of the issues that kind of need to be worked through before this formulation could be useful in the way that we want it to be. Okay, so the first is, when we started out talking about application-oriented research, we talked about it in terms of problems. We're interested in people using technology to solve problems. Okay, so the claims that we've been talking about in some sense, don't make value judgments about themselves, about whether they actually lead to solving a problem. So there's something else that needs to be described that isn't represented in the A leads to B under C formulation. So that's a sort of separate conversation. But it gives us something that we can talk about. We can talk about whether claims lead to solutions or not. But typically, I think one argument we could make is that in application-oriented research, problems come from outside HCI. So if we're interested in health, the problems and the form of the solutions and what would constitute a solution comes from the domain itself. So we would have to look to health experts to tell us, well, what are the problems? What are the things we should be concerned about? How are those measured? How are those operationalized? What are the ways that we could actually know when we've solved a particular problem? So domain knowledge is required to map the real problems to the B's, the benefits that we would look for in our design claims. Okay, another issue is that the space of possible claims that could be made is enormous and probably infinite. So there's essentially an infinite number of claims that could be made about any particular design space. There's an infinite number of attributes that a system could possibly have. There's an infinite number of benefits that could possibly be realized. There's an infinite number of contexts in which things could, depending on how you define a context. But most of the claims are probably either wrong or obvious and just not very interesting. So there's a lot of things where we just sort of take for granted design knowledge, that feedback is useful for interactive systems, right? We don't necessarily have to articulate that. We don't have to go and find that or make it explicit. But mostly, there's just a lot of things that don't really matter. There's contexts or conditions that will just never occur or we don't really care about. There's a lot of system attributes that are not feasible, and there's a lot of benefits that aren't important. But it's very difficult to sort of quantify that in advance. That's where the sort of practices of experienced designers and experienced researchers come into play. So we typically filter claims by prior work. So we know, what people have talked about before, and therefore what's probably interesting. We have our intuition. We build arguments to try to clarify or try to stake out what claims are probably going to be interesting. We're only usually ever talking about a few of these things at a time. And then we also, through repeated exposure and lots of paper rejections and things like that, we become exposed to community norms where we kind of figure out what arguments will be accepted, what kind of things people care about, and what generalizations we're allowed to make, and those kinds of things. And I would say that this navigating the claim space, this is where a lot of tacit knowledge happens among people that practice application-oriented research. And so it might be the hardest part to teach, because you really got to know the prior work, you got to build your intuition, and you got to know what arguments are going to work for the audience. And it's difficult to sort of state in advance without lots of painful experience how to do that kind of thing. Didn't we have a header for this? No, okay, well this is supposed to say trade-offs at the top. Okay, so this is another issue. So we've presented this fairly simplistic view, the ABCs of how to make claims in application-oriented research. But in fact, in any real design problem, it can be much more complicated, right? So, okay, you're supposed to read this as columns. So the first column shows an example where, I'll kind of stand over here, where you have A1, system attribute 1 leads to benefit 1 under condition C. A2 leads to benefit 2 under condition C, but A1 and A2 are mutually exclusive. You can't have both in your system, so you have a trade-off, right? You can either have A1 or A2, and you need to figure out, is B1 or B2 more important, and sometimes that's apples and oranges, and that's a difficult thing to do. Okay, another example of a trade-off is maybe you have A1 leads to B1 under condition 1. A1 actually degrades B1 under condition 2. Both C1 and C2 are important. You need to support both of them, so you need to decide how much of A1 you're going to put in your system and whether you're going to have it in your system. So these are hard decisions to make. And you might have a situation where, what was this one again? A1 leads to B1 under, okay, yeah, A1 leads to B1, but it also leads to drawback 1. And so again, you have to decide, okay, is the drawback worse than the benefit, and so on and so forth. Another place that this gets complicated is you sometimes, often, perhaps even have dependencies. So a system attribute that you choose in order to maximize a particular benefit actually becomes part of the conditions that you now need to satisfy with another thing. So for example, you might say, well, we're going to make our system mobile because then people can use it everywhere, but that means that now we have to make sure our designs work for mobile interfaces, and now we're constrained by the amount of information we can present to people and things like that. And so you get these kind of gnarly knots of dependencies that can be very challenging to resolve. And so I would argue that just representing things as claims in this form doesn't necessarily give you a path to map through that, but it could give you a way to kind of think about it and say, okay, here's the problem that we're having, here's the trade-off, how are we going to think about this and reason about it. So this might be, in fact, the hardest part of design. And perhaps there are other representations that are more helpful for these issues, and that's something that we're kind of thinking about in that space. Another issue is that these design spaces or these these claims can be unstable in some cases. So design spaces in some sense are moving, and in particular, the conditions or the C's that we care about might be changing. So the C's have a temporal dimension, people's expectations change, people's practices change, the technology that you're using changes. All of these are potentially part of the context or the conditions under which a claim you might think a claim holds, and so it means that we constantly need to reevaluate these claims. So we're never going to run out of work. That's good news for us to do this kind of stuff. So another way to think about bigger is better is that it can be more enduring. So it actually spans over a wider range of time. So if it's something more fundamental and not ephemeral, related to specific forms of technology, then it might be more enduring than if it's something that doesn't. Another thing I want to point out, just to indicate that we're aware of this, is that we're aware that this is not actually how design happens, right? Evaluating claims and sort of sitting and mapping out, like if I do A, it will lead to B, but if I don't, I'll go to this other thing, right? So a lot of design knowledge, I would argue, is for the people that are actually designing the applications, including us when we're doing it, is implicit, right? We have a lot of system attributes in our toolbox. You know about a lot of sort of design techniques, things you can put in, design patterns, design concepts, heuristics, and so on and so forth. And you have a certain amount of experience about how A's lead to B's, either because of systems you've been exposed to or systems that you've built. And you might have experience with particular contexts or conditions, right? You might have worked in a particular domain, so you know what to expect in terms of this particular user population or what the constraints of this technological environment are. And if we don't have that, we might go and conduct formative research to get a better sense of what those C's are, what those contexts and conditions are. And because we don't know really that much, a lot of times, about exactly how the A's are going to map onto the B's and the C's, we have iterative processes in the actual design process to try to figure out how it's going to work and gain evidence as we go. So that's how design works. It's not necessarily about mapping these claims or evaluating them in some kind of argument structure. But part of what we're arguing here is that research actually has a different role, right? So if we're providing insight or information, reusable knowledge that can be used as part of this process, we need to actually be in the business of creating explicit, reusable, actionable knowledge. And so we're arguing that we need to think about, well, what does that knowledge look like and what are the forms that it can take? We're arguing for specific forms. Okay, so as Paul mentioned, we promised you an epistemology and an ontology. We've maybe given you an ontology of epistemological things. Not really, sort of. But we've proposed a form of portable knowledge that could be the basis for an epistemology. So now we're saying, well, what are the things that you could have knowledge about? What's a form that it can be represented? So around which other types of knowledge can accumulate. But what we haven't provided you is saying how you build or assert or defend that particular knowledge. That's a subject for another day. We could say provisionally that there isn't any real privileging of particular methods, at least in what we've said before, right? So all methods that you could think of that you might have seen in HCI research can have a role, from ethnography to experiments, design research to data mining. So we see lots of different places that this stuff can fit in. We might argue, however, that prototyping, building actual systems, and field deployments have kind of a special place in this type of research because we get a certain type of knowledge by building something that embodies a certain set of design claims. Whether or not we realize what those claims are when we're going in or whether we figure it out later, we gain evidence about whether they worked in that particular condition or not. And so that's a particular role that this plays, and it might be more privileged in this domain than it is in, say, other types of HCI. And that's it. We've actually finished with plenty of time, which is great, because we'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. So we're going to leave this form up here so we can point to it as we go forward. As Paul mentioned, we're very interested in kind of seeing if this makes sense, if it seems useful, where does it break down. And I'll make one more plug, which is that there's a doctoral seminar that's meeting on Friday afternoons, which is talking about application-oriented research. If you're interested in this, that's one place that you could come, participate in conversations, and give us some feedback. Okay. Okay.
So I thought that a lot of the details that you mentioned were very specific to HCI, but I thought that a lot of the core principles that you discussed, mainly this breakdown, kind of are applicable to all research. Do you have a comment about that? I mean, what is it about HCI that is particular in regard to this kind of?
Well, I think, I would say that it's, in particular that we're talking about system attributes and benefits to the user. So there's a lot of knowledge, scientific knowledge, that doesn't necessarily have this form, right? I mean, you could say this is, in some sense it's cause and effect, but part of it is that this influence, we're kind of being weaselly about that, right? But no, I would agree. I mean, in some sense, when we say the basic form of a claim, we're saying that's kind of the basic form of a claim, but we're scoping it around design knowledge because we're talking about system attributes, conditions of use, and benefits to users.
Just to channel Mark accurately, we say they might not just be system attributes, they might also be socio-technical attributes. They could be a social norm, it could be a social practice. But that might also be an attribute. Yeah.
Can I just push on this a little bit more? I mean, you're describing, I like the simplicity of it, but you're describing what looks like any engineering arm of computer science, and in fact, any academic engineering field. If I was designing a new file system, and that's my A, and I would say it has these performance characteristics under these failure conditions C. But if it was designing a new engine, I would say it would have this kind of performance under this set of strains, right? Like this set of stress or whatever it is. So I guess what's the benefit of this as an explanation in general, and maybe even specifically HCI relative to other?
We're saying we're not unique. We're mapping this general approach to accumulating generalized knowledge to our situation by saying what are the kinds of things that are A's for us and what are the kinds of things that are B's and what are the kinds of things that are C's. So you can have certainly propositions in chemistry, you could say for A, B, and C, but they are socio-technical attributes, benefits, and contexts. So we're not trying to contrast with the rest of engineering. We're trying to put it in the context of the rest of.
So is it saying that applications-oriented HCI should just be like any other academic engineering discipline?
Well, figuring out what the A's look like and what the B's look like is a challenge for us. But yes, we are saying that just as in other engineering disciplines, they try to make general claims of, I showed this. I think it's true more generally. We're saying yes, we should try to do that same thing here.
So I think another way, I guess when we say the basic form of the claim, and we posit it as being, I see it, you could see it either as that's somehow unique to application-oriented research, which would be surprising if it was, right? The other way is that this gives us a way to talk about the issues around application-oriented research. So what makes a good claim in application-oriented research, right? So that's what we want to get to.
And to answer my own question, I guess I would say that in engineering, you would like if I was building a new file system as plumbing, right? Like other people would be using that file system in other plumbing. And with HCI, it feels like where you stop, you're done, right? Like that particular thing is like a complete system. You've already touched the human being, and nobody's going to build on it, which makes it a little bit more problematic. I think it's more obvious in other engineering disciplines how you want to take that and run with it in an academic area, whereas with HCI, that's not as obvious.
Well, I think in particular with application-oriented research, because there are some HCI stuff that's like about, how many degrees of freedom should a pointing device have, which apply to a lot of domains within human-computer interaction, right? It doesn't matter if you're looking at information about your health or you're looking at information about your energy usage. Being able to select targets on the screen is.
That's the other direction, right? That's the academic from the scientific side of measuring rather than building.
Say that again?
There's academic disciplines that try to measure, like understand something about the world, and others that try to build the engineering disciplines.
I see.
That are building from one.
Okay, well, yeah, but I think that example is not clearly one or the other, because it's a design claim. In some sense, yes, entirely.
So I agree with the previous two comments that I think this is a generalized form of all good science. And I actually think there's a value in making this clear in design because I don't think it's often made clear, and so people are not clear about what their contribution is. But assuming that this form, is good for science, then one question for you is, we have in the design community some people who don't believe they're doing science, and who take an interpretivist approach. How do you see their contributions as fitting into this?
There are two possible answers. One is that they're one of those earlier forms, one of these things that are stepping stones along the way. And the other is that they aren't making a contribution. So they're either doing one of these things or they're not making a contribution. Is I think the strong version I would answer.
Yeah. I feel totally comfortable making such a strong statement, but that would be, but I think, but basically, by giving information that would say, here are some things that we should attend to. Either we have a better understanding of the people that we're designing for, or the practices, the norms, things like that might tell us, these are the C's that we should. So when we build our system, if we don't understand the important characteristics of the C and we test it in the wrong situation, we'll get it wrong or something along those lines, right? So to tell us which A's ought to apply.
Which, by the way, doesn't mean that they aren't making some contribution to something else, that they wouldn't be making contribution to application-oriented design. Maybe it's anthropology.
Okay, so Mark seems to want to, with really HCIC, 2 hands and.
I just wanted to say some interpreters do think they're doing science, they're just doing a different kind of science than positive design. He said.
Okay.
Not very useful, Mark.
Well, I want to push back on that statement about
that isn't a pushback. I mean, you have to actually say what is the form of science if it isn't either any of these things or
I didn't say that. I was speaking to Tara's statement.
Okay.
I mean, I agree with that, and I just wanted to add that it can also be the nature of the relationships. So there's sensitizing concepts, and then, as you'll see in my talk in a couple of weeks, sensitizing relationships as well. But, right, and we've talked at times about, you know, that there are very precise statements that one might make, and for sensitizing concepts, for example, or interpretive statements, you get fuzzier statements in a certain sense, but they cover a much larger area of the design space.
Right. We talked about this on Friday, actually, that there could be a trade-off between making, you know, a strong claim would be one that's very precise, probably, and supported by evidence, but it might apply to fewer situations. And a weaker claim that has less evidence or is maybe more provisional, but applies to a wider set of situations, might be a more impactful claim, right? So there's kind of a trade-off in that, you know, you decide to do, you know, an experiment that totally nails this one thing, but is very constrained by that C, you know, and, you know, the A is very tightly constrained to what you specifically did, you know, or do you try to make the claim a bit broader? Yeah, Tawana.
So I think, well, first of all, I think this is beneficial in application-oriented HCI because I don't think it's here. Whereas, you know, it makes sense for other, you know, engineering, or, but it would definitely help me in terms of articulating what a contribution may be. But my question, and maybe it's related to this sensitizing concepts, but when you say application-oriented research leads to specifically, you know, system design attributes, I guess I'm saying that AR could lead to a little bit more. So my question is, why is it? Yeah, I guess it would be what are the other forms of, or why does it have to be design knowledge? Why wouldn't it be other forms of knowledge? And so I'm thinking theoretical. He talked about social norms, but I just wanted to know why the limitation and constraint to design.
So you're saying that you could imagine an application-oriented research project that actually leads to a social science contribution.
Yes.
So some more general thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think that
And
that'd be
maybe
nice.
Maybe even technical contributions. Who knows? But I mean.
Right. That's actually right.
Right. So why? Yeah, I was just questioning why kind of constraint.
So the reason for this is that there are other kinds of contributions that are already recognized.
Through application oriented.
That we understand that if it would, nobody knew how to compute this thing, and I figured out how to compute it with the available resources. People understand that as what kind of contribution that is. And if we say, here's a property of human beings, and I want to show something about how the human memory system works, and I do an experiment, people understand that. The place where we've been struggling our whole careers, and we feel like the whole field is struggling, is articulating what is a contribution other than that. What is a contribution that's directly about understanding attributes that lead to good outcomes? I'm with you on, and you know, Mark and I aren't completely on the same page yet about what kinds of attributes are things that we might have leverage over as designers. I don't think it's only technical attributes. I think there are other things that we can influence as designers that are more social. And I would include those here.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak to the framing of focusing on benefits and drawbacks as as opposed to a more value neutral term like outcomes, which I think would acknowledge that things are rarely so black and white, and that what's a benefit to one person may be a drawback in some other way that we haven't anticipated.
I have two answers to that. One is we were calling them outcomes up until the time we made that slide. We realized that if we just called them benefits, we would get ABC. That's one answer. and an O just wouldn't look as good up there because it might be a 0.
But there's also a substantive answer.
There is a more substantive answer, which is that the argument is that ultimately in design there are values, right? you have, in application-oriented design, you are, you have a problem by our definition, which you could argue with, but by our definition, you have a problem that you want to solve. And you can map that onto benefits and drawbacks to the solution of that problem. So it is true that ultimately what the knowledge that you actually get is, application or attribute, leads to, well, one form of knowledge that you could get is, an attribute leads to an outcome. And that giving it benefit or drawback, that terminology gives it a value judgment. But the argument is that in design, the values actually do matter. You do actually have a sense of what would be better, what would be a.
I think that that confidence may be misplaced. That rarely, right, would you really have knowledge that this is indisputably a benefit.
But this is the practice. Designers are trying to do things that achieve certain things.
Yeah.
But the
And
other
so
thing is that
we're trying to highlight the fact that designers do have value judgments. They're trying to make the B's happen and not make the D's happen. They might be misguided. Maybe they should have been trying for the D's, but calling them the B's and D's calls attention to the fact that is the kind of knowledge that you're after, and that designers do have. Now, mechanically, there's really no difference between a B and a D in this system. So it's purely a rhetorical choice to try to highlight. And you're saying we shouldn't be doing that because the designers might be wrong, but we're saying we want to do it because we want to highlight that the designers do have a position.
I think what Nicole's saying is that the arrow can be stochastic. So
That's
it's not,
definitely true.
Well, that's
that's
different.
not necessarily true.
She wasn't saying whether it's uncertain whether A leads to B. She was saying it's uncertain whether B is a good thing or not.
Well, I was referring to the labeling of the rhetorical strategy that you're using, but
Which
I
is
think
whether
the
B is a
Charles
good-
point is part of it as well, that we don't always know exactly what else is happening within that era.
Right.
And in that you would have to so closely bound the conditions under which this would apply with Paul's argument that maybe you're not doing science in the way that you could do if you were just to take a step back and say outcome.
So I'm curious what you think about whether or not, to what extent does it matter to learn, or to what extent is it useful to learn that A leads to B, or to what extent is it useful to understand why A leads to B? So it seems like the more you understand why, you basically open up design possibilities for what A is and for what maybe C is, right? And so it seems like the real usefulness is partially understanding that A leads to B, but even kind of to make it more generalizable as HCI research, so that other systems that may make use of it, that really understanding why seems like it's a critical piece.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, I think that's not necessarily represented here. We're pretty fuzzy in general about the arrow, as you may have noticed, right? It's just like there's some impact, but the more you can say about it, the better. But I think adding that, why, sort of the theory. I mean, the other thing is that we kind of glossed over is that, there might be like a chain, like you have an ultimate B that you want to get to, like, better health outcomes, but then there's kind of, you have to backtrack to the thing that you can actually measure in your system, like do people look at the screen ever, right? And so, whoops.
My calendar thinks I should be leaving here.
Okay. So that's kind of another issue, but that doesn't quite get to you. So, I mean, you could take what you did and you could like explode it. You could put, you could say under what circumstances. But I think you're talking about the mechanism. I agree. I think the knowing mechanism.
I think this is critical, and we should push ourselves on it. I think what we intended here, and let me try it out and see if it would work, is that if you're able to articulate the A's, you are in a sense essentially saying why. Because you're saying that here are the A's where it works, and here are the other things where it doesn't. So if you just had this situation, this system leads to this benefit, and you haven't said why, but the form of a why is it's because of this attribute. This was the secret sauce.
Yeah,
so I
it
think
just seems like if you, I mean, there may be sort of something in the middle where it's maybe this attribute, but there may be 5 other attributes that would have to lead to be in sort of essentially the same way, and those other attributes you know, or maybe other C's that we, you know, they constrain in the same way, so it kind of opens up the design space for more, you know,
Right.
more general applications.
So you might, for example, say an ambient display leads to, you know, greater, you know, physical activity, but you don't know if it's just because they looked at it and reminded them that they were participating in this study, or was it because they actually looked at the flowers and it made them want to get the bigger flowers?
Right.
Right, and so knowing the why would actually be important to tell you what other things might have worked there.
I'll take the last one back.
Okay, this also relates to the arrow. Do you have anything in this framework where you would show that A should not lead to B? So there's a commonly held assumption and you go to research, you think you're gonna get A to B and you don't. Because a lot of times I feel like research is biased to positive outcomes, because you're like, great, I found the solution. But they don't report enough where you don't find the solution, so other researchers keep doing the same studies. Or designers use the same principles without realizing that they're not actually effective.
Well, so those can be several forms. One is we tried something slightly different attributes, and we didn't get these results. Or we tried this with a different set of people in a different condition, and we didn't get these results. And I agree that we want to report all of those, and we want to have, you know, if this doesn't capture something about a whole set of related claims, and maybe some other notation is needed for that.
I think you're talking to two things. I mean, one is I think that can be valuable, and you can publish it if everybody thought that A would lead to B under condition C, and you show that that's not true. What happens a lot though is you try a slightly different C, you don't get A to lead to B, and that would be valuable for people to know, but you can't publish it.
Right, no, I mean,
You know, we just don't have a mechanism for doing it.
There'd be way too many of those examples. But
Right,
the ones that
exactly,
people
'cause we
really
mostly
assume
fail.
that A leads to B under C is where you show that it doesn't.
Cool. All right, thanks, comments, diatribes, we would be happy to hear afterwards.